I guess I'll just say a little bit about my view of libertarianism and political philosophy. Right. This book, The Problem of Political Authority, it's about what I consider the foundational problem of political philosophy, which is why does the state have authority? I argue that, well, the answer is it doesn't. There's no satisfying account of the source of the government's authority. Right. And by the government's authority, I mean something that's supposed to explain why they get to coerce us in ways that would not be permissible for anyone else. So if I decide to go around taxing people, people will call me an extortionist and a thief, right? I go to my neighbors and I say, hey, I've got this program to help society, and now you're forced to contribute to it, right? I would be called a thief. In fact, then the government would come and put me in jail. But that's the same thing that they're doing, right? So, why do we think it's okay for them, right? And basically, I go through different accounts of why the government is special, or like why they don't have to follow the same moral restrictions that the rest of us have to follow. And, none of the accounts are any good, right? So that's like the short version. And then I claim that this leads to libertarianism because basically, these are the basic principles behind libertarianism. First, there's a kind of presumption against coercion. I'm not saying that all coercion is wrong, but I'm saying that you shouldn't coerce people without a good reason. And there's some sort of common sense judgments about what does or does not count as a good enough reason. I don't have a complete account of what all the good enough reasons are, but but you don't need one in order to arrive at libertarianism. Right. So, for example, defending yourself from somebody else's coercion, that is a good enough reason to coerce people. Getting other people's money because, you want to donate it to charity, that is generally not considered a good enough reason. And that is not specific to libertarians. Rather, almost anyone will agree with that. If I go out and I try to forcibly take other people's money in order to give it to charity, almost everyone will say that I can't do that. Okay, so, presumption against coercion. Second principle is the coercive nature of government. That is, you have to realize that virtually everything that the government does is coercive, right? Maybe not actually everything, but almost everything. And in particular, the laws that they attach legal punishment to are coercive. So, if you break the law, generally some armed person will come if the government discovers you. Some armed person will come and try to kidnap you and lock you in a cage for some period of time. Sometimes they will just demand that you give them money, which they call paying a fine. But if you refuse to give the money, then armed people will come and kidnap you and lock you in a cage and stuff like that. Okay, so that is coercive. Most people don't think about the coercive aspect of government, but it's not really controversial. So if you think about it, people don't really dispute that it is coercive. It's not like we're just voluntarily deciding that we want to pay taxes to the government or whatever. Okay, so, three core principles that are at the foundation of libertarianism, I was saying. Number one is the presumption against coercion. Two is the coercive nature of government. And three is skepticism about authority. By skepticism about authority, I mean, I don't see why the government should not have to satisfy the same moral restrictions that the rest of us do. I don't see why different moral rules would apply to them. Right. And so if it would be wrong for us to go around stealing other people's money in order to give it to charity or whatever, or, in order to fund wars in other countries, looks to me like it's wrong for the government to do that. Okay. You arrive at libertarianism from this because the things that the government is doing that libertarians oppose are just the things that everyone would oppose if anyone other than the government was doing it, right? So if you think about it, in America, there are various gun control laws, right? Restrictions on what guns you can own or, what you can do with them, whatever. If I decided to impose those restrictions on other people, just like anyone else, because I just decide this is a good idea, people would say that's wrong. I can't do that. right, collecting money to give it to the poor. If I decide to do that, everyone would say that that was wrong. That's not specific to libertarians or conservatives or, leftists or whatever. That's just like a mainstream ordinary view. Okay, so I claim that the actual difference between libertarians and everyone else is in the third principle, skepticism about authority, not the first two. Ordinary people are not really disagreeing with me about the presumption against coercion or the coercive nature of government. They're disagreeing about authority. They think the government is special. However, practically no one has an account of why the government is special. Like if you just talk to ordinary people, hardly anyone can actually answer why the government gets to violate the moral principles that apply to everyone else. If they do give an answer, it's easily refuted within 30 seconds, right? Because they didn't think past the very first stage. Like, well, there's a social contract. We all agreed to have a government. And then you point out that actually we did not. That actually, as a matter of empirical fact, nobody ever made that agreement. And then right. Anyway, okay, so my defense of libertarianism differs from the traditional defense of other libertarians, like, Ayn Rand or Murray Rothbard, in that I'm emphasizing, this third principle, skepticism about authority, and I spend my time talking about that. The other libertarians traditionally emphasize the point about coercion, and they traditionally take a very strong stance, right? They take a very strong moral, very strong moral position. Like they take an extreme moral theory and dogmatically insist upon it, and then, try to deduce libertarianism from that. I think that's a bad approach because, first, you don't need that extreme moral theory. You just need common sense morality. And, that's not the actual source of disagreements with non-libertarians. The actual source of disagreements is that they think that the government is subject to different rules from the rest of us. And that's what you should spend time talking about. Also, if you point out this thing about authority, it actually puts the statist on the defensive. It now becomes their obligation to say why they think the government is special, as compared to the traditional approach where, you give some sweeping moral theory, and then it's your obligation to defend that theory, right? Which, by the way, is not going to work out very well because there are always tons of counterexamples, right? When you give this sweeping theory, like it's always wrong to initiate the use of force, right? And then people just start giving these counterexamples, and then you sort of dogmatically insist that they're not really counterexamples or whatever. And then, other people are just unconvinced because, as a matter of fact, you haven't given any justification for the axiom other than that it seems right to you, but it doesn't seem right when, you consider the counterexamples. And so, all right. So, I think my approach is better than these sort of dogmatic moral philosophy approaches. Ayn Rand's approach is particularly ill-fated because her idea is we're going to convert people to libertarianism through egoism, which is like the least popular ethical theory ever. And she knows that, right? So here's my strategy for getting you on my side politically. First, I have to convince you that a moral theory that is dismissed by virtually everyone, not only today, but throughout the history of the subject. I first have to convert you to that. And then I'm going to convince you of the benefits of capitalism. That does not seem like a promising approach, right? Okay, one other approach that libertarians take is just sort of giving economic arguments. You would think that this should work, but for some reason it doesn't work very well. And I think basically what happens is people are resistant. They sort of they're constantly looking for ways of not accepting the economic conclusions because they have a moral objection, because they think that capitalism is immoral or something like that. Right. And so what you have to do is you have to attack the moral assumptions, right? You have to get people to see that actually it's the state that's immoral, right? And so that then they could be open to hearing the rest of the case for liberty. All right, so that's my spiel about libertarianism. I'm also an anarchist, but I don't usually come out with that straight away. And I think it's a lot harder to get to anarchism. The argument for libertarianism is, as I've described, but then to get from there to anarchism requires a lot more discussion. You need more empirical discussion of economics and history and such. So I will leave that there for now and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, let me start. I have a few questions, and the first one is really a follow-up on what you said, which is the ill-fated approach of Ayn Rand. I mean, if that's the case, why was she so successful? I mean, if you ask libertarians in the US at least, but I think also in Israel, many of them would attribute them becoming libertarians to Ayn Rand.
Yeah, good question, right? So, first let's ask how successful was she, in fact? So she was influential with certain people, right? Like Ayn Rand's approach works on certain people, and it works very well on this, particular group of people, but that's a small minority of society, right? The vast majority of society is totally alienated by Ayn Rand's approach, right? So there are a bunch of people who love her, but there's also a lot of people and more people who absolutely hate her, right? So, if you really wanted to kind of maximize your persuasiveness, you would sort of tailor your approach to the person, and you have to know the person's personality and see if they're going to like this very aggressive approach, right? And, the majority of people won't, but maybe you meet somebody who's, sort of into that. How's that?
Yeah, I think it actually makes sense. I think it might make sense. As in, it's a factual question how many people were actually influenced by her, but I can see why some of a very special character would be influenced by her very special approach. Another answer I would give is probably that she's the only libertarian, a big libertarian, a famous libertarian thinker that wrote mega best-selling books. Maybe if Rothbard was a good enough author to write something that was as successful as Atlas Shrugged, maybe he would be the one that everyone attributes them becoming libertarians to. So maybe maybe you need to be a brilliant author. Although,
that's a good point, right?
You can argue how brilliant she was, but you see my point.
Yeah, no, Rothbard is also he's a similar style of writer, and he's also very skilled at it, but he's not a novelist.
Yeah.
So I think that is a key. If we had more libertarian art, right, that would be more effective. It's just the novel is a more effective medium for reaching people.
Yeah. I mean, there's one science fiction book that's always being depicted as libertarian, which is, of course, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. But it's a horrible book in my view, but let's leave that for now. That's a subject for another argument, another topic. My next question is, of course, COVID-19. For instance, the government in Israel, and I think also in the US, is maybe discussing enforcing people to get immunized. And in Israel, we've already moved to the third injection, and people can't, I think, as of today or yesterday, people can't enter, rock shows or whatever without presenting a document that proves that they were vaccinated. And again, as I said, there's pressure now to get the third vaccination. So do you think in a case of something like COVID, does it make sense, or it's permissible on a moral ground or philosophical ground for governments to force people to get vaccinated?
Yeah, good question. In principle, I don't have a problem with vaccine requirements for a deadly disease. There's a factual question as to whether this disease is bad enough, so to speak, and the vaccine is good enough to justify that. But I don't think that it violates libertarian principle. So the reason is that, you're just going about your day in a normal way could actually be posing a physical threat to other people's bodies, if you're a carrier of a deadly disease. which, you can transmit by breathing near someone. Okay, so like if you knew for sure that you had a disease, like a deadly disease, and you knew that it would be transmitted by like breathing on someone, then it would clearly be wrong to breathe on them, right? And, it would be a rights violation. And it would be the business of the government to stop you from doing that. Okay, now, in fact, that's not the case. You don't know if you have the disease, but you could have it because a lot of people are asymptomatic. You don't know that you're going to transmit it, but you could transmit it. So it's just a difference in probabilities, right? So then there's just a question as to, well, how high does the probability have to be before it makes sense to require it, right? Okay, now, there are practical questions about sort of the effects of the policy. In the United States, it's become very politicized, and maybe it is throughout the world. I don't know. Like it's become that vaccination has become a political issue where like suddenly now it's the right-wing position that you don't need vaccines or something like this, and the left-wing position that you do. And so unfortunately, because of the politicization, that means that the policy will work less well than it would have, right? That means it's going to create resistance. It might like start protests, right? And then the protests themselves might be super spreader events, things like that. So it might actually backfire. And you have to think about all of these empirical questions that I'm not expert on how to weigh those. So I'm not really sure.
Okay. I'll just say very shortly because everyone has more questions here. But I'll just say that in the case of COVID, probably the issue, exactly like you say, that it's not clear that the disease is so lethal, and it's not clear that the vaccine is so efficacious.
Yeah.
Had it been the case that COVID was a terrible thing, let's say it's Ebola, but it is as contagious as COVID, then you wouldn't need the government to tell people to be careful and stay indoors. And in the case of COVID, the reason the governments are so imposing all of the rules and vaccines and whatever is because people aren't scared enough. And people aren't scared enough because it's just not such a big deal. But that's my attitude overall. But, okay.
Yeah, for young people, it's not very dangerous, right? Like extremely low risk if you're young. But if you're old, there's a significant risk.
Yeah. And yeah, okay, exactly. I mean, if you're above 60, 70, 80, then everyone knows at this stage, a year and a half after this thing got to the Western world, everyone knows the facts, everyone knows who okay, whatever. I think we can move on. The next question I have, and then we're going to stop and let the people in the audience ask you questions. My last one is on the right to bear arms. I know that you support the right to bear arms, so if you can just spend 2 minutes, explain your position, and then I have a question.
Yeah, I mean, here's the short version of it. If you have any rights at all, then you have the right to defend those rights. And I think that's kind of implied in the notion of a right. Like, if I have a right to life, then that means that I can use force to stop someone from taking my life. In our society, as a matter of fact, a gun is the most effective means of self-defense. If another person is attacking you, if they have a gun, you need a gun. If they don't have a gun, you might still need a gun, right? If a man is attacking you and you're a woman, you probably need a gun. Or, even if you're a man and two men are attacking you, you need a gun. And these things are not like weird scenarios, right? There are plenty of people who live in places where they are actually in physical danger and the government is not able or willing to protect them. This is not a rare situation. This is very common, in America. Like, there are plenty of people who live there. There are cases of the woman whose estranged husband has threatened her life, and the police are not going to do anything, right? Because they can't follow her around all the time, right? And the U.S. government even says that they don't have an obligation to protect any individual, right? So, like, if you try to sue the government for failing to protect you, your suit will be summarily dismissed, right? Because the court will say the police have no obligation to protect you. This is actual, like, legal doctrine. I don't know if it's true in every country. Okay, but so they're not going to. Well, they might protect you, but they might not. They're not promising anything, right? So you have the right to do something to protect yourself. Okay, so this is the short version of it. I think, okay. I have examples that are supposed to sort of draw out your intuition. So let's say that there's a victim who's in his house at night, and there's a criminal who breaks in, and the criminal is about to stab the victim. Okay. And then suppose that the victim is reaching for a gun to defend himself. And then for some reason, you come in and you grab the gun and run away, with the result that the victim is then stabbed to death. So the killer is guilty of murder, obviously. But what about, you who grabbed the gun and took it away? Right. And you're supposed to have the intuitive reaction that, yeah, you basically became an accomplice to the murder, right? Like, that's a rights violation. It's maybe not as bad as the actual murder, but it's not a lot better, right? It's fairly close. Okay. And that is analogous to the government taking away people's guns in the knowledge that as a result, some people are going to be killed or robbed or raped or whatever.
Okay. So let me ask you a question about something that actually happened in Israel, I think about a year ago. It's Aryeh Shif. I think the audience knows the name because it became quite a famous case. He's a farmer. He wakes up in the middle of the night, goes out and see a guy that's trying to steal his car. He shouts at him to stop. The guy starts to drive away. The farmer points his gun at the guy that sits at the driver's seat. He pulls the trigger and the guy dies. And I guess another fact that you should probably be aware of is that this is an area that the police is complete impotent. They don't do anything to protect people and their possessions. And this guy that shot his pistol, which he held legally, was a victim of robbery and theft many times. So would you consider him a criminal?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the reason why there's any question about this at all is that it's standardly accepted in ethics that there's a proportionality condition on self-defense. So yes, you can use force to defend your property as well as your person, but generally you can't use grossly disproportionate force. So, if somebody was trying to steal a stick of gum from you, and, chewing gum, and, you shot them dead, not okay, right? However, I think a car is a bit of a gray area because that is a very valuable item, right? So I think that might be enough to justify shooting him. Also, like when you shoot, you don't know if the person's going to be killed, right? Most people who are shot do not, in fact, die, right?
Yeah.
Because, they go to the hospital, they take the bullet out, and the person usually survives. So the question is whether it's okay to take the risk, right? I guess like my initial kind of intuitive emotional reaction is I don't want to prosecute that guy, but I think I might be wrong. I think it might just be my lack of sympathy for criminals.
Yeah. By the way, I'm sorry, it's a tough question because not everything has a clear answer. I mean, I think it probably helps to think about the situation as if the police simply doesn't exist. Let's take the exact same case, but there's no police. Not that there's police and they're being ineffectual, they simply don't exist. What do you do to protect your property? And then I think if you think about it like that, it's becoming a little bit more permissible. Although, it remains a gray area.
One consideration I have is look beyond just this individual case, right? What if there was a ruling that said, no, you can't shoot somebody who's stealing your car? How would other criminals react to this, right?
By stealing cars?
Yeah, now they'd be like, oh, great, right? Now if I see a property owner and he's pointing a gun at me, I'm just gonna, take the stuff and run away, right?
Yeah. And another way to think about it, I guess, is what happens if this Shif guy, the farmer, wakes up and the thief is not outside stealing his car, but inside stealing his TV. Yeah. Okay. You can.
So yeah, if it's in your house, then I think you shoot him.
Yeah, you shoot him just to make sure he doesn't do any harm to you.
Yeah, that's right.
Just to be safe.
You don't know what he might do, and you don't know if he has a weapon, right? That he might take out if you give him a chance. So
yeah. So you just,
like the case where the guy's actually driving away, you kind of know that he's not going to do anything.
Yeah. It's more complicated. Okay, so we have plenty of people in the audience that want to ask questions. I don't know who was the first one, so I'm just going to. I see Leo Blair wants to ask a question. Leo, please go ahead.
Hey, hi, thank you. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, it seems that you're are you an intuitionist? Like what's the methodology? How do you know you're right, basically? It's okay to want to convince other people, but we also want to know that we have, if not the truth, at least some method of getting to the truth.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I have a book called Ethical Intuitionism. Which I would show, except that it's over on the shelf. So I am an intuitionist, as you guessed. What's the method for approaching moral questions? Yeah, so basically, this is part of the method for everything, for answering everything. Start with the assumption that things are probably pretty much the way they seem, unless you have a reason for doubting that. Okay, so it seems to me that murder is wrong. So unless somebody gives me some pretty good reason for doubting that, I'm going to assume that that's correct, right? Okay, and so, you take there are these cases like, my example where there's the criminal who's going to stab the victim, and then, the victim wants to defend himself, and then you take away his gun. Most people have a pretty clear intuition about that. So it makes sense to assume that that's correct unless given a reason for thinking otherwise. If the intuition is particularly widespread, then it's generally more reliable. If it's a particularly strong, firm intuition, then it's generally more reliable. If you're trying to resolve a controversial issue like gun control, you want to appeal to intuitions that are less controversial. Right. Okay. So does that answer that enough? I can't hear you. I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Oh yeah, by mistake. It does answer the question of whether you're an intuitionist or not. It doesn't satisfy. It doesn't seem to me to satisfy like a good methodology, since, for example, when I argue with people, they have completely different intuitions than me, and it seems to them, for example, that it's very clear to them, for example, that we should have gun control, or that the government should mandate certain things. And it seems like if I also, just from experience, if I explain to them why the government and coercion in general is bad, then they would just reply with, no, coercion is a good thing. That's basically my general experience. And it's very, very widespread. It's very widespread. So it's also basic principles. You wouldn't think that human beings have good intuitions, the same reason that we don't have good intuitions about economics or about natural sciences. Morality is even more complicated than that, in a sense.
Yeah, so, a couple of things. So, like, when you said, oh, well, people have different intuitions about gun control or whatever, that's why I said that stuff about appealing to less controversial intuitions, right? So, like, when I'm arguing about gun control, I don't say, intuitively, you have a right to own a gun. I don't say that because that's, highly controversial and, it's shared by conservatives, but not by liberals, or what we call liberals here. but I appeal to something that is not, it's not correlated with your political orientation, right? So like that hypothetical example of somebody breaking into somebody's house and then, you stop the victim from defending himself. Like even, Democrats tend to agree that you did wrong, right? And so like, that's why that's a good starting point. When I'm arguing about government coercion, I don't just say coercion is bad, right? I say, well, here's an intuition that you probably share, which empirically almost everyone does, right? Like, I can't go out and do this stuff that the government is doing, right? And it's like, yeah, and like most Democrats, even Democrats agree that I shouldn't go out and start coercing people in the way the government is doing. So then it's their burden to explain why the government is different from me and everybody else, right?
I agree that intuitionism, broadly defined, is a good method of argumentation in many cases. I would just point out that not in all. Like, for every example you just gave, like, I have actual examples of people who would say, no, it's completely fine if I did what the government does. So it's just my comment, but thank you for your answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, there could be some fringe people who have, so if you meet somebody who has weird intuitions, it may be impossible to persuade them. It may be nothing that you could do. Right. Yeah. I wanted to comment on another thing, which is when people say, oh, we have unreliable intuitions about such and such, how do they know that? And if you think about how they know that, it's going to turn out that they know that on the basis of their intuitions. Right. Okay. So like, oh, people have bad intuitions about probability. So that's a particularly common one, right? Yeah. And how do we know that they're bad? Right. And then, well, I'm going to appeal to the axioms of probability theory. Oh, well, how do you know the axioms? Right. And well, you knew that by intuition, right? Like the people who are doing the study that's trying to convince you that people are no good at probability theory are assuming that they themselves know probability theory. Right?
Well, for probability theory, it is actually incorrect. It's not from intuitions. It's there's simply, well, first of all, we have the incompleteness theorem, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? So it's not that you can actually, it's true that you can't prove everything, but there's some a priori truths that you can actually, if you referred back then to Ayn Rand, she actually gives some examples of a priori truths, some things that you, if you take the negative of them, then you get caught up in a self contradiction. So that's
okay,
one.
But so I mean, first, Gödel's theorem doesn't apply to probability theory. Right? It only applies to formal systems that are capable of, sophisticated enough to represent arithmetic on the natural numbers. But anyway, yeah, how do we know the axioms of probability theory? Right? Because like in fact, when people say, so like this is an example, the conjunction fallacy, right? It's a mistake in which people think that the probability of a conjunction could be greater than the probability of the first conjunct. Okay. That's not true. How do we know that that's not true? Well, you can refute it from the axioms of probability theory. It's not the case. So it's not because like there's some sort of self-contradiction in saying that. It's because it contradicts the axioms of probability, right? So like what you said is true about the law of non-contradiction, right? But there's not very much that you can get. Like if you're limited to the methodology of showing that denying your view results in self-contradiction, there's hardly anything that you can get from that. Usually what you do is you have to sort of like try to fudge to make things sound like contradictions that aren't really, right? Or you have to sort of like make assumptions, but say things in a way so that it's not obvious what you're assuming, right? But basically the only thing you can get from that is the law of non-contradiction. Right, which is usually not in dispute.
Okay, let's move to another question. I think again, I don't know if I'm getting into the right order, but Yuval Ben Itamar or Yuval Ben Itamar.
Yes, thank you. I would like to get back to the basics of what you say about the government, and it's not so, and it makes, I'm not sure it makes sense to say that the government should have the same moral obligation as natural persona. And when you ask yourself about how do I define what is the moral obligation of a person or the government, you need to have a basic theory. And both Kantian theory and utilitarian theory, basically any theory trying to explain what is moral for human beings, is irrelevant to government in certain senses. Like, if you ask by Kantian vision, it's irrelevant because something is moral because I'm a human being. Therefore, it's inexplainable why would the government have morality at all. So you need to explain from the beginning why, sorry, my question is kind of long. You need to explain from the beginning why would the government have any obligations, and try to imply why would that come from the same place as obligation for people, for human beings. And another thing, I think the obvious questions, the obvious answer of people would not be social contract, but simply that the government is aggregation of several people, so it has different burden of proof and different way of operating. So I'd like to hear your opinion about that.
Okay. I mean, so there were a couple of things that you said. I mean, one was about how when you're making ethical judgments, you need a theory like maybe utilitarianism or Kantianism. And of course, I disagree with that. I don't think that I need a theory. And I think almost no one has a theory. They just make an intuitive judgment about particular cases. I mean, I think there's a big mistake in philosophy of thinking that knowledge goes from the top down, that the way that you know things is by starting from an abstract universal principle and then deducing consequences. And I think knowledge goes from the bottom up. You start from judgments about specific concrete cases, and then you draw generalizations. The way you get to the abstract universal principle is starting from individual cases. Anyway, that was something of a digression, though, because I think your main point was, the government isn't a person. So why assume that the ethical principles that apply to people would apply to it, right? So the government is a collective agent, not an individual, okay? But I think that doesn't make any difference, because you can take examples of other collective agents, and they're not going to be exempt from the moral constraints, right? So like, take the Exxon Corporation. So if the Exxon Corporation enslaved someone, that would be wrong. Just like it's wrong if I as an individual do it. Like, nobody's going to give them a pass because they're a group instead of an individual, right? Or the Exxon Corporation, acting collectively kills someone, that we're going to think that's wrong. This is perhaps because these collective agents are made of individual agents, and the individuals are subject to moral constraints, which require them to act in such a way that the group wouldn't be committing one of these wrongs, right? Like, if I work in the Exxon Corporation, I'm probably morally obligated to act in such a way that the Exxon Corporation won't count as having killed someone, right? If I can, right? If I can prevent that, right? So similarly, why does the government get to do stuff that corporations are not allowed to do, right? And if you're in the government, you probably have a moral obligation to behave in such a way that the government won't have killed someone or stolen somebody's money, et cetera, right?
I think it still doesn't answer the basics, because corporation obviously does not have the same moral obligation. For example, you can't say it is wrong for a corporation to rape someone because it simply can't. So obviously, morality will come from a different place. And there is other examples. We just think about different entities differently. For example, if I take your intuitive example about government, if I'll come to you and tell you, please give me your money, I might be able to give you more money, and maybe I just won't, and you will lose your money. That would be wrong as a person, but that's a definition of how corporation in the stock exchange works. You understand them differently. It is much more basic than they are from a couple of persons, and they have the same obligation as a person's.
Well, okay, wait.
Inside.
I mean, your example was the principle that it's wrong for an individual to rape someone, and you're saying, oh, that doesn't apply to corporations. But I don't think that's really true, right? Like, your reason for it not applying to them was that they actually can't do it, right? But I don't think that means that they're exempt. It's not like they're exempt, like it would be okay for a corporation to rape someone, right? Imagine an individual who can't rape anyone, like a baby. Right? So like it's not like, oh, the baby has a different moral status, so like he has the right to rape people. No, right? Like he's not exempt from the principle. It's just that he doesn't have the opportunity to violate it, right? But if a baby or a corporation could rape someone, it would be wrong, right? So like, it seems like the same moral standard applies to them. Anyway, the important point is the stuff that the government is doing is stuff that you would not accept any agent doing, whether collective or individual, right? So like, if the government is taking our money, if any agent, even another collective agent, were to take our money in a similar way, we would say that was wrong. So like, it looks like the statist needs some kind of justification of why the government is special, right? Which can't just be because it's a collective agent.
Okay, let's move on. Shalom Kramer.
Yes, hello, thanks. I'm going to continue from your last sentence. You said that a government shouldn't have the right to do something which an individual doesn't have. But it seems as if your first principle, that coercion is immoral except for common logic, pretty much allows it, if it's common logic, that the government should have more rights than other people, and which seems the case.
Okay, I think you mean common sense morality or something, right? Not logic.
Okay, common sense morality.
Okay, so yeah, so most people think that the government is special. So does that mean, we have good reason to assume that that's true? So you might think, oh, like it just seems like the government is special. So, right, that's a reason to think that it is. But I think we have reasons for doubting that, right? When I said we should assume things are the way they seem, unless we have a reason for doubting it. There can be reasons for doubting it. Okay, now, most people, if you tell them this thing about how, the government is doing a bunch of stuff that would be wrong if anyone else were to do it, their reaction is not, oh, yeah, so what? Because they're the government, it's fine. Almost everyone sees that you need some kind of explanation, right? Which is to say that in addition to having an intuition that the government gets to do this stuff, they also have the intuition that that needs an explanation, right? Like most people can see that. And then they try to give an explanation. And then it just turns out that every explanation that people try to give is no good, right? And then like they're appealing to false factual assumptions or appealing to moral principles that they don't really accept. They could be shown in other cases, right? You see what I mean?
You didn't say that it's for the common good.
Yeah, it's for the common good. Yeah, so what if I decide to do stuff for the common good and I use the same sort of methods that the government is using?
But then they say the government is the exception. The government can do things for the common good because we voted for them and we let them decide what is the common good.
Okay, right. So the question is, why are they special? Right. So it can't just be because they're acting for the common good, because people other than the government could act for the common good, but you wouldn't think that they had special rights. Okay, and then the other thing you said was, oh, we voted for them. Notice, by the way, that the vast majority of governments throughout history have not been democratic. So you'd have to say that most governments are illegitimate, right? But anyway, okay, so we voted for them. Is that a satisfactory explanation? Right, okay, so, suppose that, you and I and a few other people are sitting at a table and like we're having dinner. And then at the end of the dinner, we're at a restaurant and there's a question of who's going to pay the bill. And like I say, well, everybody, we should just like all pay for what we ordered. Each person pays for what they ordered. And then, you say, no, I think Mike Huemer should pay for everyone. And then let's say, 3 people agree with you and, only like 1 person agrees with me. Okay, now do you have the right to forcibly take my money? So it seems like the answer is no, right?
Yes.
And what this shows, what this shows is that having a majority does not enable you to suspend other people's rights.
But I didn't say that they have the majority. I said we voted for them. We chose people.
Yeah. So in my example, the people vote. So, right. So would you say that gives them?
But no one chose it. If we would have said, okay, let's now choose the people who will decide who will pay the bill, and everyone agreed that there will be a method of choosing the people. Nobody agreed. So I don't agree to do this voting procedure, but you just take the vote anyway, because that's like the government, right? Okay, so you just say, I'm going to take a vote. Okay, and then, does it make a difference if you first choose a person? So like you say, I'm going to choose somebody who gets to dictate who pays. And then, you vote for Bob. And you do that knowing that he's going to force me to pay. That's the only reason you're voting for him, because that's also like how government works, right? People vote for a politician because that politician promises to steal other people's money and give it to them, right? Okay, so, sitting at the table, you vote for this guy and say, hey, and I don't agree. I'm like, I don't think we should be taking this vote at all, but the other people at the table are like, we don't care what you say, Huemer, because there's more of us, right? So then do they have the right to take my money? I understood your thought. Thank you.
Great. Let's move to, I might be misspelling the name, Anais. Anais? You need
yes,
to...
it's Anais.
Anais. Okay, I got it right.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So first, I love your book, Dr. Huemer. And I have a question regarding Israel, because you mentioned a few conditions for a libertarian society to succeed. And we are lacking at least 3 important ones, which would be the society maintains strong social and economic relations with its neighbors, the society lack large internal religious or ethnic tensions, and the society were not established in a region of long-standing territorial dispute. So are we... how could I say that, lost here, or is there still hope that we could do something?
Yeah, you're in trouble there. So anarchy would probably not work in Israel at this point, right?
Yeah.
Because they would just immediately be attacked by their neighbors. Mm-hmm. You would be immediately attacked. So like, you just have to have a military. At some point in the future, it might work, right? Sometime, but who knows how long this will take, right? After the Arab-Israeli conflict is resolved, that will eventually be resolved, right? It won't be going on 10,000 years from now. But
it might.
Yeah, it might take a while. Yep. Sorry.
I have another question. Can I ask?
Sure. Go ahead.
So I learned about the Machiavelli's paradox of liberty, which would be that the more a society becomes free, the more it becomes prosperous, and the more it becomes arrogant, and then it would decline and fall. So would you think that this is a threat to a libertarian society, or could we manage without the prince to somehow figure something out?
If I can continue immediately with a follow-up, isn't that exactly what happened to the US since its inception, certainly since 1913 or so? A libertarian society, the richest in the history of humankind, and now see where you are. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know if this principle is true. So like, I think most generalizations that people have about how societies in general develop are false. And they're sort of like, they're going to be based upon, anecdotal data. Like they'll be based upon somebody's interpretation of a few cases where different people would have different interpretations. And like, and we don't have a, scientific survey of all the cases and so on. So like, I'm skeptical that this is true. About the United States, like, well, we haven't fallen yet, right? And I am going to quote Warren Buffett because, during 2008, when there was the Great Recession, there was like a huge panic about the economy, like about, the housing bubble and so on. Everybody was in panic and the stock market was crashing. And Warren Buffett, the world's greatest investor, published an editorial in, I don't know, some major newspaper called Buy American, I Am. And, so, he just like bought more because the market was crashing. And of course he was right, because he always is, right? And he said, for the last 200 years, it has never paid to bet against America. And this is not going to be the time to start. And so, I remember that periodically when people, panic about whatever the latest thing is, right? There's always something that people are panicking about, but, it's like never paid to bet against America.
Would you say that the level of freedom in the US has dropped over the last 100 years, stayed stable, went up and down at the same time?
Yeah, hard to say. It's hard to give an overall characterization. The US had, serious problems that we've mostly gotten over, mostly having to do with discrimination, so racial and sex discrimination, which we got over. Now, is that a freedom issue? It was a freedom issue for the minorities, right? Like they didn't have the same freedom, but a lot of it was not from the government. Like a lot of it was individuals discriminating, but some of it was actually the government discriminating. So, you have to count that as a significant increase in, respect for people's rights. At the same time, there's a lot more regulation than there used to be. So that's going in a bad direction. But, I don't think that's inevitable or unstoppable, right? Like, I think there's a lot of critique of it. So I think it remains to be seen how it will develop. There are a lot of people who see the problems with regulation, right? And it's possible that we will succeed in persuading most of the country.
So you're an optimist?
Pretty much, right? So I should say it's complicated. The world is complicated, and my view about that is complicated. So I think we might destroy ourselves. Like I think the human species might go extinct in the next few hundred years, and that's not like a totally remote possibility. But if we survive, I think we're going to just get much better off. And why? Because that's been going on for a long time. If you look over the course of history, if you look at the way people live, the way people used to live, you're going to feel a lot better about your life and the way things are going now, because as you go further into the past, it gets more and more horrible, right? And it's just, we're fabulously wealthy.
Slavery, executions, torture, disease, and so on.
Yeah. So, when you think about that, like, wow, it's just been getting so much better, right?
Okay. Eilam, you want to ask your question? You've been waiting for a while.
Yeah. Michael, I heard what you said about the idea that you want to make morality more even, but like the morality argument, like you want to basically argue, let's keep the current morality and just say the government doesn't have a special place in it, from what I understand. But do you think maybe there's a room for arguing it from the standpoint of the general morality? Like, for example, I see in recent years, especially a lot of issues about free speech. People bring a lot, you can shout fire in a crowded theater and stuff like that. and you feel that many times it's being used as a justification to take away people's, some people call it reach, some people call it freedom of speech, and sometimes it feels like it sort of creates this issue where maybe morality itself eventually leads to loss of freedom. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, wouldn't describe it as morality. I mean, like maybe false morality leads to a loss of freedom, right? There are some cases where if your values improve, you get worse policies because you have false factual beliefs or something like this. So like this isn't directly about what you were asking about, but like one of the reasons why the welfare state expanded in the last century, especially the last 50 years, is people started to care about the poor. So, it used to be that, people thought the government gets to do whatever it wants, but who gives a shit about the poor? So we're not going to do anything. And then they changed to still thinking the government can do whatever it wants, but then thinking we care about the poor. So that is a moral advance, right? It's just that it's combined with another mistaken belief. Your example about free speech. I mean, one thing is I think a lot of people have, I don't know how much people really believe this, but people assert, false factual beliefs, right? So like that there's a lot of harm done by people expressing bad political ideas. Like people just saying their political view or their view about human nature or whatever, and it hurts your feelings and that causes psychological damage. And I think that's just factually false. Like nobody is significantly psychologically damaged because they hear political disagreement with them, right? I think people, your example of shouting fire in a crowded theater, like people could be seriously harmed by that. But there's a couple of differences between that and bad political ideas, right? The shouting fire is essentially making a false factual claim, assuming there isn't actually a fire. So it is a matter of objective fact that there isn't a fire. But when people express their political view, it's not really a matter of objective fact that they're wrong, right? It's a matter of opinion. And then the other thing is people are going to be physically trampled, that's the point of the fire example. But, when you say like, oh, you make this allegedly racist remark, it's like, well, the only thing that happens is that somebody feels irritated momentarily, right? So somebody momentarily feels offended. So, nobody ggets trampled or whatever.
But if we'd like to expand on it, I feel that many times it also comes from some sort of a very paternalistic kind of style, like, say, I want to help other people because they are naive and they don't understand things. Like now in the COVID, a lot of people say we shouldn't allow people who oppose vaccination or mask to speak because they might convince people to not vaccinate or wear mask. And it's like, it's both to say, I'm smart, I understand that this is wrong, but I think other people are stupid and they need to be protected from their own stupidity. And you basically say, don't believe in stillmaning an argument. You're saying if it's such a bad idea, I wouldn't argue against it. I would prevent it from being said in the first place. And you have people who think that's a good thing, that's a moral thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is that people could be driven to do bad things by benevolent motives. And that is true. Like if they have other beliefs that are not correct, right? About that, I'll just comment, like, I think the plan of suppressing speech in order to prevent people from adopting bad ideas or, mistaken ideas, I think that can actually work if you have total control of information sources. So like in the Soviet Union, I think it actually did work that they suppressed information. Like they succeeded in suppressing a lot of information about how bad their system was. A lot of people, like most of the people still hated it, but they probably didn't hate it as much as they should have. And they didn't realize how much better the West was. Also, they didn't realize that everybody else hated it because no one was allowed to say it, right? So that could work. However, it requires you to have total control. Like it does not work if there are just competing sources, right? Because what's going to happen is when you try to suppress people from talking, they're going to go to the alternative information sources. So what's happening is like the mainstream media is like driving people away from listening to them. Like conservatives don't want to listen to the mainstream media anymore because they're left-wing bias. And so they just go into their own conservative bubbles. And so like, it's not going to work. You're just going to push them further away.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? And Michael, do you have more time? Oh, yes, sorry. Basic. I'm sure that's not the real name here, but let's let Basic ask his or her question.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's my name. It's my last name. No, but seriously though, a lot of libertarians talk about the market for defense, right? Firms, providing military service, military defense. Some even talk about them being aggressive. There are all sorts of ideas, but you seem to have an opinion that is not that's not compatible with a anarcho-capitalist society. Can you expand on that, or like what? If I can, just a moment. Usually, the economic argument is that if you have a free market of a service, it's going to be generally more efficient than if you have central control of it. So why not in the case of military defense?
Yeah. I mean, so like, I'm not against somebody starting a military defense company, but I doubt that it would. I doubt that it would work economically, right? Because it's a public goods problem. So, right, because like if it's really national defense, it's like it's providing defense for the whole nation, and that means that people who are in the nation who haven't paid are still going to get the defense. So it's going to be hard to get people to pay. So like, that's why it's not going to work. And then, you think about, could there be competing defense agencies? I mean, that's also a little weird, right? And competition is it's an important part of why capitalism is better than socialism. Like, if you have capitalism, but like there's only one firm, it's monopolistic, then that usually doesn't go very well. Like, it has the same problems that government has, right? Because the problems of government just are the problems of being a monopoly. But like, if there was already this national defense firm that was defending us against foreign invaders, like, why would somebody start up another one, right? And so I think that you would have a better chance.
If I can just do you think the same about, for example, police services? I mean, in many respects they are similar, right? There's a lot of parallel between the police, right, or private police and private military.
That's right. Yeah. So like, I think there's a difference of scale. So I think it's feasible to have competing security agencies to defend small areas, right? So like, there could be 5 different security companies, and like you could choose among them. And that's viable because like they have multiple different customers who are like, like different apartment buildings, right? Or different business owners are hiring these security companies, and the company is defending that specific business or that specific building or whatever, right? And so it makes sense, like, it's economically viable, like you would pay the company to defend your specific property, right? But with national defense, it's more like they're supposed to defend the whole nation, right?
Right. So essentially, you're talking about the public goods problem, right? That's essentially
right.
Okay.
Yeah, like, I mean, police services are not a public good, right? The police can very feasibly refuse to defend you if you didn't pay, right? Yeah. So like, that's why that's not really a public goods problem.
Yeah, but is it really that it would really be that off to say that it is in some sense true of military protection as well? Like, if you don't think about a society or a modern day country as a country, but as just a collection of different landowners, etc. Maybe you're familiar with like David Friedman's arguments or Bob Murphy's. They talk about this topic a lot.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so you might think, oh, maybe national defense could be a private good too, because like the national defense firm could say, yeah, we're going to defend this region, but not this other region, right? But could they say we're going to not defend specific individuals or specific buildings? I mean, that's a little weird. And the thing is, like, you know, government militaries are so large and powerful that, like, it's hard to see a private company mustering enough resources to resist the government military, right? So, like, you know, you have a private security guard company. So it's totally feasible for them to be defending you from private criminals, but, like, could they be defending you if the Russian army shows up, right? That doesn't seem very feasible. You'd have to imagine, like, a very large company committing a lot of resources, right?
But if I can interject, how would that then, like, is there no other such case where you can say the same about a government being able to muster a lot of economic power for a goal, like in other markets, perhaps? Why would that not be true?
Yeah, I mean, so look, there are other public goods problems, right? There's a problem of pollution, especially air pollution, right? Big public goods problem. So what are we going to do? Like, yeah, you know, in the anarchist society, we're probably going to have too much pollution. I mean, we're going to have more pollution than we want, right? It's not going to kill us, but it's going to be more than the optimal amount, right? Because of the lack of a government. Yeah.
I mean, I would think that for a country like the USA, maybe imagining anarchism is easier because you're so much bigger and richer than your neighbors. You know, you have two oceans on both sides. You have Canada to the north, Mexico to the south. Mexico might be perceived as somewhat hostile by some, but it's extremely poor compared to the US. So you can imagine how a private market in security can easily protect a country so rich and naturally protected like the US. I agree with you that in the case of Israel, it's a lot tougher to imagine how that's going to work.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's a presentation by Bob Murphy that was mentioned here by Mr. Basic, where he tries to explain how it works, but it's theoretical.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, if a country like that works, it's probably one of those cases where you want to see it first that it works well, and then you immigrate there. You don't move to be in the beginning when they actually start the you know, the trial.
Yeah. I mean, you know, look, so I would suggest that we start with privatizing the police force, privatizing the courts. You obviously get rid of all the, you know, non-libertarian regulations and so on, right? We start with that, see how it goes, right? And, like, you know, keep the military around for a while. And then, you know, we can think about, like, reducing the size of the military, right? And, you know, eventually the world is going to evolve to a point where everyone is democratic. You know, we're about half democratic now, and the trend is in that direction. When that becomes the case, then it will be more feasible for a country to be anarchic, right? Because you know, democracies basically don't just aggressively attack.
So you know, I know we're running towards probably the end of your patience, but let me ask a couple of more questions then, because just basically as a follow-up to what you said just now. I mean, if you look at two of the richest countries on this planet that provide amazing standard of living to their citizens and are big targets for immigration, they're Hong Kong, you know, Hong Kong of 3 or 4 years ago, and Singapore. Both of them are half dictatorships. Hong Kong is whatever, you know, I mean, none of them is a real democracy. So do you feel that democracy is a condition for human flourishing or human development, or he's just a great example like Hong Kong, a semi-dictatorship that is just an amazing country?
Yeah, well, I guess I think, you know, like Hong Kong is probably headed down, you know, if the Chinese Communist Party remains in power. Eventually, the CCP will collapse, I assume, and the whole country will become democratic. But before that time, they're probably going to increasingly impose on Hong Kong. That's a very unusual case, though, right? Because of its specific history. Like, it's weird that that happened. Anyway, you know, democracy generally works a lot better than the other forms of government, right? So, I mean, just like looking across the world and across history in general, right? You get less, basically democracy works for avoiding huge, obvious problems, right? Like widespread famine. There's hardly ever a huge famine in a democracy, but it happens very often in dictatorships. And like having aggressive wars with your neighbors, just like attacking them for no reason. The United States is an outlier. We sometimes, we have some aggressive wars, but anyway, but most democracies, and we don't attack other high quality democracies, right? Because it's unpopular. There are problems with democracy. It's not the ideal. The ideal is anarcho-capitalism. There are problems because, it doesn't do well for social problems that require thinking and information, like that require doing a lot of study to figure out the answer, because the voters are not going to do that study. And therefore, the politicians are not going to recommend policies that don't immediately seem obviously good, that only seem good if you do a certain amount of study, right? So like that's a problem with democracy. But anyway, but it's better than dictatorship. So like the way I see it is we're probably moving towards the world being democratic. And then after that, maybe we become libertarian.
I hope you're right. A last question from me. Oh yeah, it is pretty much the last question. I told you earlier that my nephew stole your book from me, right? The one I wanted to present. And I also had an argument with him a couple of days ago about the definition of conservatism. Can you define conservatism? Because I find that people have a hard time understanding what conservatism is. And I also find that conservatives don't exactly know what it is that they actually believe in. So can you try to explain that?
Well, I'm not sure that I can. So like traditionally people say, oh, well, conservatives don't like too much change, preserve the valuable traditions or something. But then I see like that doesn't do a great job of explaining the positions that are policy positions that are associated with conservatives, right? It's like, they want to repeal Roe versus Wade. Well, like the pro-abortion Supreme Court decision. Okay, they want to ban abortion, but that's a significant change, right? Roe versus Wade has been around for decades, so it's now the status quo. So if you want to repeal it, you're for change, right? And so it's not really a good explanation, right? That they just don't want change. And then, you think there are these different positions. You could just list the positions that are associated with conservatism, but actually it shifts over time. So in the US, it used to be that the Democrats were the interventionist foreign policy party. And, they were more in favor of going to war in other countries, which, by the way, this kind of makes sense. If you think that the government is really good at running your own country and they know how to tell people what to do, kind of makes sense that you'd think they'd be good at taking over another country and telling them what to do too. But anyway, so that kind of made sense. But then it shifted. Maybe because of Carter and Reagan to the Republicans being more hawkish, right? And then with Obama, it's shifted back to the Democrats being more hawkish. And Trump being less hawkish, right? So it's and when the leaders shift their positions, then the ordinary people just shift their position. Like the people who call themselves conservative for many years, they just like that switch a position that they allegedly held for whatever many years or decades because the leader of the party has taken a different position, right? So now conservatives don't believe in free trade anymore because of Donald Trump. Because Trump was against free trade. It's just there's no, there's no intellectual definition of this position, right? What it is it's a tribe. There are two tribes of people in the US, the red tribe and the blue tribe. And the positions that you take are just the ones that the other members of your tribe are saying. And, maybe the leader of your tribe says it, and then that becomes your position because you don't actually care about the issue. You just care about rooting for your side, right? I think that's what's going on, right? And that's why there isn't a good definition.
You don't seem to like conservatives.
Well, it's exactly the same for the liberals, right? Or the leftists, right?
Yeah, but with them there's there is an ideology that you can kind of define. I guess people are stupid and we need strong leaders to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm simplifying it and maybe I'm completely misrepresenting them, but there's an ideology. Still, the conservatives, the ideology, the guiding principle, well, like you just said, is just so hard to define. It's weird because so many people, I think, define themselves as conservatives. And it's weird that such a thing that is common, supposedly, to so many people is so hard to define.
If I can interject a bit, don't you guys think that it has something to do with religion sometimes, at least sometimes?
Oh, I mean, traditionally conservatism is associated with religion, but it's associated with a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So like the Republican, like I don't know the politics in Israel, okay, so I can only talk about American politics. Anyway, the Republicans for a while have been like sort of an alliance of different factions, right? They're like the economic conservatives who kind of like made this alliance with the religious conservatives, but they are very different beliefs, right? But recently the Republicans have sort of like abandoned the economic conservatives, right? Anyway, but I mean, what you were saying, it's weird that it's hard to define something that's so common, but actually that's true of everything. Okay, basically what you learn in philosophy, what philosophers learned over the last century was that you can't define anything, right? That's a slight exaggeration. There are a few things that could be defined. Basically, you can define mathematical terms, okay, but almost no other word in the language can be satisfactorily defined. Okay. You know, obviously I can't prove that to you now, but like if you look at the literature on defining knowledge, it goes on for decades and it just gets more and more complicated. But like every account that somebody has, there's some counterexample that refutes it. And then you get like more complicated accounts and then there's another counterexample. It just goes on that way, right? And nobody ever agrees on what the actual definition is.
Okay. So on this optimistic note, you know, unless, sorry, Michael, do you have more time or is this enough for you?
I mean, well, I have time if there's more questions.
Okay. Does anyone has any more questions? Yeah. But easy ones because Michael's tired.
Yeah, we don't have to force everyone to stay. I don't know.
No. Okay, fine.
I could ask a question about morals, though, if that's okay, not about politics.
Sure, Mr. Mason.
I was wondering. Wait. I lost my train of thought.
About morals?
Yes. Okay, never mind. I forgot about it. Sorry.
I think that's probably a sign we should stop right now, Michael.
Okay. All right. It's been great. It's been fun.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining. And of course, a big thanks to Dr. Huemer that gave us a lot of time. From his sanctuary in Colorado.
Yes. All right. Thanks, everyone.